Today I'm going over the section in chapter 4 called The Ego-Body Illusion. All things work together for good. There are no exceptions except in the ego's judgment. Because in our true state, which is spirit, it's all good, right? It's all love. But only from the ego's perspective and the ego's judgment are there exceptions to things being all good and all love. The ego exerts maximal vigilance about what it permits into awareness. And this is not the way a balanced mind holds together, right? Because when we're in the ego thought system, we are not in a balanced mind. The ego is thrown further off balance because it keeps its primary motivation from your awareness and raises control rather than sanity to predominance. Okay, so the ego is thrown off balance because it hides its objective from us. We are not aware of it, and it seeks to dominate over us and have control. The ego has every reason to do this, Jesus says, according to the thought system which gave rise to it and which it serves. It has its own kingdom, its own thought system that it has built, and it is going to continue to serve that thought system. Sane judgment would inevitably judge against the ego, right? Because if we were in our right mind, we wouldn't do that. We would judge against the ego and must be obliterated by the ego in the interest of its self-preservation. Meaning sane judgment must be obliterated in order for the ego to preserve itself. A major source of the ego's off-balance state is a lack of discrimination between the body and the thoughts of God, right? Because there's a complete difference between the body and the thoughts of God, but ego lacks discrimination between those two things. Thoughts of God are unacceptable to the ego because they clearly point to the non-existence of the ego itself, right? No thoughts of God allowed, says the ego, or it would disappear. The ego, therefore, either distorts them or refuses to accept them. So the thoughts of God, meaning knowing that we are love and knowing that we are one with one another and with God, the ego either has to distort those thoughts or simply refuse to accept those thoughts. It cannot, however, make them cease to be. So no matter how hard the ego tries, it cannot make God's world and God's thoughts cease to be. Because that's all that's real, and they will always exist. They are eternal. It therefore tries to conceal not only the unacceptable body impulses, but also the thoughts of God, because both are threatening to it. So the ego is threatened both by things within the ego thought system and also things within God's thought system. The ego is threatened by everything all the time because it's so wimpy. Wimpy and vulnerable things tend to overcompensate by trying to control and dominate. Being concerned primarily with its own preservation in the face of threat, the ego perceives them as the same, right? All threats feel the same to the ego. By perceiving them as the same, the ego attempts to save itself from being swept away, as it would surely be in the presence of knowledge. Just more words to say that the ego doesn't want God's thoughts to come into our mind because it would be the end of the ego. Any thought system that confuses God and the body must be insane. Yes, we are acting insane when we do that. Yet this confusion is essential to the ego, which judges only in terms of threat or non-threat to itself. That's it. That's all the ego's looking for. Threat or non-threat. In one sense, the ego's fear of God is at least logical, since the idea of him does dispel the ego. But the fear of the body, with which the ego identifies so closely, makes no sense at all, right? Because none of the things that the ego does or thinks makes any sense whatsoever. The ego is threatened by things within God's world and things within the ego's thought system. The body is the ego's home by its own election. It is the only identification with which the ego feels safe, since the body's vulnerability is its own best argument that you cannot be of God. So the ego chose our body to run and hide in its pretend world, in its illusory world, thinking that this is where it's going to be safe. But in the meantime, our bodies are vulnerable, and this vulnerability is the ego's argument against why we are not of God, because everything of God is invulnerable and eternal. So we purposely put ourselves in this vulnerable position to tell ourselves, this is the ego, to tell ourselves that we are not of God and that we are vulnerable. And then we end up in fear all the time because of this position we put ourselves in. And as he says, this is insane. It's insane and it makes no sense. This is the belief that the ego sponsors eagerly. Yet the ego hates the body because it cannot accept it as good enough to be its home, right? Nothing's ever good enough for the ego. Here is where the mind becomes actually dazed and confused. Being told by the ego that it is really a part of the body and that the body is its protector, the mind is also told that the body cannot protect it. Therefore, the mind asks, where can I go for protection? To which the ego replies, turn to me. The mind, and not without cause, reminds the ego that it has itself insisted that it is identified with the body. So there is no point in turning to it for protection. The ego has no real answer to this because there is none. But it does have a typical solution. It obliterates the question from the mind's awareness. Once out of awareness, the question can and does produce uneasiness. But it cannot be answered because it cannot be asked. These are all riddle-like words to explain to us how we are afraid, and then we want protection, so we turn to the ego because the ego speaks first and loudest, and spirit is silent and waits patiently for us. So then we fall for the ego. We seek protection from the ego, but then the ego is unhappy with everything, so we do not feel safe there, and this whole process is completely insane. We keep looking for safety and turning to the ego, but then nothing is found there. No safety is found. No stability is found. So that's why this question of where can we find protection causes uneasiness. And it cannot even be answered because it cannot be asked because the ego doesn't even exist. This is the question that must be asked. Where can I go for protection? This is what we want to know. Where can we go for protection? Seek and ye shall find does not mean that you should seek blindly and desperately for something you would not recognize. Meaningful seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. Meaning, if we want protection, we need to focus our mind on God's thought system. We need to focus our mind and ask Jesus or Holy Spirit to guide us to our truth. These are the consciously directed thoughts that he is speaking of. The goal must be formulated clearly and kept in mind. Learning and wanting to learn are inseparable. Meaning, as soon as we want to learn and we tell Jesus or Holy Spirit that we want to learn and we are open to our truth, we will automatically learn. They will be there for us immediately to teach us. That's why learning and wanting to learn are inseparable, because they happen simultaneously. They are connected. You learn best when you believe what you are trying to learn is of value to you. However, not everything you may want to learn has lasting value. Indeed, many of the things you want to learn may be chosen because their value will not last. We often choose to learn things within the ego world, and those things don't last. The ego thinks it is an advantage to not commit itself to anything that is eternal because the eternal must come from God, right? And the ego doesn't want us to go to God. So it wants to focus on things that are temporary because then it doesn't feel threatened. Eternalness is the one function the ego has tried to develop, but has systematically failed to achieve, right? Because the ego just wants to keep living forever. It wants to be eternal, but it has failed to achieve that. Even through the illusion of reincarnation, it attempts to be eternal, but it has failed because it's not real. The ego compromises with the issue of the eternal, just as it does with all issues touching on the real question in any way. The ego doesn't want to deal with truth. It doesn't want to deal with the real issue. By becoming involved with tangible issues of the ego world, it hopes to hide the real question and keep it out of mind. Right? It wants to trick us, which it has successfully done with all of us. The ego's characteristic, busyness, right? That's the ego's characteristic, busyness, with non-essentials is for precisely that purpose. Okay? The ego wants to keep us busy with non-essentials, keep us very busy with things that aren't important and do not matter. Preoccupations with problems set up to be incapable of solution are favorite ego devices for impeding learning progress. Right? A fancy way to say it gives us a whole lot of smoke and mirrors of pretend problems to keep us stuck in a loop of busyness so that we don't ever lift our heads and go, wait a minute, what's really going on here? In all these diversionary tactics, however, the one question that is never asked by those who pursue them is, what for? Meaning, what is all this for? This is the question you must learn to ask in connection with everything, says Jesus. What is it for? Right? Because the ego wants to tell us something very different about what it's for than Spirit's thought system. If we want to wake up, what everything is for is forgiveness. If we don't want to wake up and we want to stay lost in the ego's dream, then everything is for staying busy and being confused. That's what it's for. That's what everything in the ego thought system is for staying busy and being confused and not paying attention to the truth. But in Spirit's thought system, here in this dream world, everything is for forgiveness. That is what it's for knowing that it's not really there, so that we can wake up for the dream. So everything in this world is actually for forgiveness. What is the purpose? Whatever it is, it will direct your efforts automatically. Because whichever thought system we adhere to is what our mind will automatically be given to. That's why we have to choose which thought system we're going to focus on. When you make a decision of purpose, then you have made a decision about your future effort. Okay, that's him saying to choose, to consciously focus and choose your thought system. When you make a decision of purpose, then you have made a decision about your future effort, a decision that will remain in effect unless you change your mind. So what he's saying is that we need to choose. And when we choose which thought system we are going to focus on and give our mind to, this decision will affect everything going forward, our illusory future. The only thing that's real is the now moment. But when we choose in each now moment, Spirit's thought system, this will change our future effort, right? Our future effort will be focusing on Spirit, focusing on truth. It is a decision that will remain in effect unless you change your mind. So unless we change our mind to then focus on ego's thought system, we will remain thinking with Spirit's thought system. So again, he's telling us we are the chooser. We get to decide. We are not our ego. Really, we are Spirit. We're just confused and we forgot. So what is everything in this world for? In this illusory dream world? Forgiveness, so that we can wake up. We are literally inside a virtual reality game. It is a dream. These bodies are avatars. Our mind does not live within this body. It does not exist within this body. It is outside of space and time. Space and time are not real. They're part of the dream. And the way to win this game is to focus on truth, to focus on Spirit. And as Jesus said, if we choose that, if we choose our truth and give our mind over to Spirit, all of our questions will be answered and we will find the protection that we have been looking for. It is where all of our safety lies. And it is where the love we have always been looking for exists.